Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is Tuesday. It is time for another author interview, and I hope that you are having a great week so far. Hope you had a good weekend. I was trying to think earlier before I started recording, what did we even do this weekend? And then I remembered, oh yes, we worked and we were sick. My husband and I, nothing major, just both feeling a little bit blah at times. And so we worked both Saturday and Sunday. So I have absolutely no idea what day it is, even though I did say it was Tuesday. So I'm proud of myself for actually doing this episode on the correct day. I have no idea what day it is because we worked through the weekend and we were both feeling kind of sick. We didn't work 20-hour days or anything. We didn't make ourselves sick, but we've got a big project coming up that we've been working on, so took a little extra time. But this weekend coming up, we are going to a Christmas market, so I'm excited about that, and I'll have to tell you about that next week. Just the little Christmas market in our village here in Portugal, but I'm excited. It's my first European Christmas market, so that'll be fun. That's one of my goals while we are living in Europe, is to hopefully next year travel to different countries to Christmas markets. Our German friends sent us pictures of a couple of the Christmas markets that they've been into, and they are gorgeous. Oh my gosh, I'm looking forward to that. I know that there's just a million different some little and some big Christmas markets all over Europe, right? So that's on my goal list for living here. At any rate, we are not here to talk about Christmas markets, although I probably could for an hour, and I will try not to next week. If it's good or bad, I'll try not to regale you with my Carvoeiro Christmas market experiences. But let's talk about a book instead. I have returning guest Carter Wilson joining me today to talk about his newest novel. It's called The New Neighbor. It is suspense, it is psychological, and here is the description from the book. Aiden holds the winning Powerball numbers. Is today the best day of his life or the worst? Aiden Marlowe is the superstitious type. He's been playing the same lottery numbers for 15 years, never hitting the jackpot, until now, on the day of his wife's funeral. Aiden struggles to cope with these two sudden extremes: instant wealth beyond his imagination and the loss of the only woman he's ever loved, the mother of his twin children. But the money gives him and his kids options they didn't have before. They can leave everything behind, they can start a new life in a new town, so they do. But a huge new house and all the money in the world can't replace what they've lost, and it's not long before Aiden realizes he's merely trading old demons for new ones, because someone is watching him and his family very closely. Someone who knows exactly who they are, where they've come from, and what they're trying to hide. Someone who will stop at nothing to get what they want. And that is the description of The New Neighbor by Carter Wilson. There's so many things that I want to tell you about this book, but they tend to be the good twists and turns in the story, and so I can't tell you about them because I don't want to ruin things. But it's a ride, I'll tell you that. Aiden has obviously some crazy issues. I mean, he just won the lottery. That's a life changer, and not in a good way for a lot of people. His wife just died. That obviously is hard. He's trying to now raise 7-year-old twins who are dealing with their own grief and their own lives being disrupted. And so he's got a lot. You know, those there's that whole checklist of things that if one or two of them happen in a year, you've had a really, really rough year, and they involve death of a loved one, maybe something like winning the lottery, moving, those sorts of things. Well, Aiden's checking off way too many on that list in this book. That'll get you started on Aiden's character. And then he starts having these threats and these notes left for him in this new place where no one should know him and no one should know that he's won the lottery. And it just goes from there. And it like I said, takes a lot of twists and turns. And you should definitely check it out if you are interested in the good old psychological suspense thriller genre. But I'm going to let Carter tell you more about the book. So again, the book is called The New Neighbor. The author is Carter Wilson. Let's go to the interview.
Hi, Carter. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here again.
I'm glad to have you. And we are here to talk about your newest novel, The New Neighbor. Before we do that, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself, both for those who maybe didn't hear the first interview or who maybe need a bit of a refresher.
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing for about 20 years. I kind of started writing out of the blue and found that I enjoy writing dark psychological thrillers. So over the past 20 years, I've been fortunate enough to have 8 books come out, all standalone thrillers, of which The New Neighbor is the latest. And it's been a long, bumpy road, as most writers will attest. But I'm finally in a place where I'm just grooving with my books.
Nice. And the New Neighbor is standalone, but it does have some tie-ins with your last novel, The Dead Husband. So we'll touch on that, but can you give an overview of The New Neighbor? Excuse me.
Yeah, for sure. Most of my books, I don't outline. So most of my books the only I know is usually the opening. I never know the ending, never know anything else. And just, I have this idea for an opening. I don't really know what it means or who these people are, but it's just an opening that was interesting to me. And in the case of The New Neighbor, I just pictured this, 35-ish year old man at the funeral for his wife. And she left behind a couple twin children, and it's just this devastating scene. And at one point during the funeral, he finds himself this character finds himself alone with his wife's casket just for a few minutes. And it's kind of this last opportunity to say goodbye. And as he's doing that, his cell phone buzzes in his pocket, and he checks, and it's a text informing him he's just won the Powerball. So that was the opening that came to me. I love this idea of somebody who is going through just emotional devastation while winning the lottery. What does that do to you? So that was the setup for the book. And essentially he moves his family into a mansion, and dark things start happening as he slowly loses his mind. So that was where I was going with it.
All right. And he just happens to move into the same house that was the location for your last novel. So how did that come about?
Yeah. So I finished the last novel, which is called The Dead Husband. And the house in that book was actually a bit of a major character, and it's a mansion, but it's a modern mansion. It's a 1980s gaudy suburban mansion. And when I finished writing that book, I just knew I wasn't done writing about that house. So when I wrote The New Neighbor, I decided that The New Neighbor was going to actually take place in that same house, just an entirely different set of characters. And it takes place about 6 months after The Dead Husband ends. So they are both standalone novels, but they do have crossover elements to them. So if you were to read both of them in whatever order, there would be more, I guess, more reveals or you have more Easter eggs. So it was a bit of a challenge to write a crossover book without ruining anything in either book, so it took a while, but we figured it out.
Time to take the first break. When we come back, Carter will obviously be talking more about the book, but I'll also tell you why this book made me think for a few minutes that I might be going crazy. So stay tuned for that. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Carter Wilson. Before the break, he was talking about the new book, The New Neighbor, and how it ties in with his last book, The Dead Husband. So let's go ahead and return to that interview.
I thought maybe I was going a little bit crazy when I started reading the book, because I'm like, this feels like that house in the last book. Why does this feel like the house in the last book? And before it got to the point where, yes, you do reveal that it is the same house, I'm reading the backs of both books, trying to figure out if it says, yes, this is the same.
Right.
It doesn't. Right. So I'm sitting there, and thankfully you cleared it up quickly enough. That it wasn't like 200.
Yeah, it can be a bit confusing.
I did think I was losing my mind a little bit.
Well, good. Then my work is done.
It fits right in with your books. So good job. Your initial inspiration was that image of the main character winning the lottery at the same time at his wife's funeral. That was your jumping off point. Can you talk a little bit more about Marlowe, who's the main character, Aidan Marlowe, and how he came to be, and what about him might resonate with readers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, because I don't outline, a lot of what I do just kind of comes to me, and when it does, it's just like, all right, this is what it has to be. I don't really question it. And I just pictured this 35-year-old Irishman. He's from Ireland. I have no idea why he's from Ireland, but that's what came to me. I'm like, okay, challenge accepted. But he's really somebody who grew up, in Ireland, fairly poor, and kind of always helped with his family's pub. And he met this woman, his future wife, Holly, while she was on holiday in Ireland. And he married her, fell in love, and they moved back to the States. But he's always been this working class guy, just, struggling to kind of make ends meet for his family. They have twin children. But really his wife, his family's his life. And then when he loses his wife, it's just devastating to him. So even though it's a thriller, it's a book that's heavily rooted in the exploration of grief. And, I think some readers might, resonate with that. Some readers might not, but I just wanted to see him go through all these different things and see if he was going to make it out the other side. Because I didn't know, it's a pretty dark book, and he really goes through a lot in it, not only from, his own grief and questioning of his own sanity, but then, existential threats actually happening, as evidenced by, these anonymous notes being left in his driveway saying that he's being watched. So, that's where he was coming from.
Books like this are always a little bit hard to talk about because I don't want to give things away. But since you aren't a plotter per se, did some of the twists at the end come as a surprise to you?
They always do. I mean, I usually have an idea about the actual ending, probably around 75-80% of the way into the books. But a lot of times twists just occur to me that day as I'm writing. It just, as a writer, I'm constantly asking myself, what if this happened, or what if this, and from that comes these kind of crazy twists that then you have to kind of analyze and say, does this make sense? But what's great is if it's a surprise to me, it's hopefully going to be a surprise to the reader as well.
do you have any sort of system in place for making sure that everything makes sense? Do you have someone else that reads it, or do you go back through and make sure that the flow is right and that the twists that have just come to you actually fit in with the rest of the story?
Yeah, for sure. As every writer does, right? I mean, it really comes alive in the editing, as difficult as editing is. But yeah, so there's multiple revisions before I even show it to anyone. But then again, even after multiple revisions, you are too close to your book to really know if it's working or not. My partner Jessica is the first to read a finished manuscript, and she does some copy editing for me, and then it goes to my agent, and then obviously the editor. And I also have a workshop group that usually sees not the whole thing, but chapters here and there. But it's so critical as a writer to have those other voices to tell you if it's working or not, because otherwise you lose all context for it.
Yeah, I would imagine that it can be a little difficult. And some of the twists and turns, again, I don't want to give things away, but Marlowe can be, in some ways, he's a pretty basic father guy, family guy, but he's also very complicated in other ways. So in terms of character development, how do you keep characters, in their space, keep them, so that they're not completely becoming a new character, but also kind of monitor that development as they grow throughout the book?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, whether or not I'm writing from a male or female point of view, I'm always asking myself, what would I do in this situation? And that's really kind of the therapy of writing is to put yourself in your character's shoes and kind of safely experience what they're going through and try to kind of empathize with them in doing so. And in the case of Marlowe, he is, literally in the course of a few days, his entire world is just rocked to a place that he doesn't know if he can ever get back to the person he was. So it was really kind of a rebirth for him. And it's very easy to go on and on and on from an introspective point of view from your character. And I remember my editor even saying, she's like, all right, we need a little bit more action here because he's just thinking all the time. So, she pulled me out of that a little bit. But again, it's important for me to have that character go through that journey just to see what happens. And sometimes they do go off the rails, and that's okay. And that was certainly the case for Marlowe. He starts questioning, his own sanity and his own perspective on things. And I always felt that somebody in his situation that seemed like a pretty logical road to be traveling down. Yeah,
it's a lot. I mean, one of those things, losing a spouse or winning the lottery, would be a huge shift, but both, it's a lot. And then moving somewhere and having threats, it's all a lot. Right. And that's not even covering the things that we're not talking about in his past that people need to read to find out more.
Right. I think the past is very important to characters. I don't think you want to go super deep and spend 100 pages talking about backstory, but things that have happened in a character's past inform how they act in the future, and especially how they act in the face of extreme adversity. Sometimes your past will come very much alive in those moments, almost unexpectedly. So it's important to me that Marlowe, has had tragedy in his past and has, and that has kind of informed who he is, and certainly plays a role in how he reacts to what he's going through, in the present day.
Let's go ahead and take the second break. But this is one of those points when I really want to tell you more about Aidan and the character and what Carter is referring to here with his past and some of the things that are influencing his life now. But of course I can't. And that is part of the problem with, this being a podcast and not a book club, is that I can't tell you if you haven't read it already. All right. That's I'm done. I will let you go to the break. And when we come back, Carter will be talking about research for this book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Carter Wilson. We are talking about his new novel, The New Neighbor. Let's go back to the interview.
Did you do any specific types of research for the book? I can only imagine you're one of those authors whose internet history is very, very interesting.
It is. I have pretty dark history. But not really. I don't really like research, so I tend not to put myself in a position where research is going to be a critical element to the telling of a story. There are certain exceptions with that. But in the case of Marlowe, for example, I really needed to make sure I understood about where he grew up, the geography of Dublin. I really wanted to understand. I think that the biggest struggle was, how does he speak? What does he sound like? And I didn't want to overdo it, but I wanted to make sure when he and his father is Irish, and so when they have conversations, I wanted it to sound authentic without being overwhelming to a non-Irish reader. So that took a decent amount of research. And then the other thing I'll just note in terms of research or pulling things from the real world, part of the book was also inspired by just last year became a major Netflix series, The Watcher, about this house in New Jersey where this couple moved in and they started receiving these creepy notes saying that they were being watched. I read that article years ago, and I knew that I wanted to have that be an element into something that I wrote, and that came about with The New Neighbor. And then literally 6 months after my book comes out, this Netflix series comes out called The Watcher. I'm like, wow, art imitating life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Art imitating art.
Yes, exactly. You also, if I'm remembering correctly, Barry, New Hampshire, where the book takes place, is fictional. So did you spend much time kind of creating that town or having an idea of how it was laid out, those sorts of things? Yeah,
a little bit. I have a decent idea how it's laid out. I mean, I don't have like a diorama in my attic or anything like that, but I have this, when I was originally setting out to write the Dead Husband, the book prior to this one that was set in Bury, New Hampshire, I was looking for a town in New Hampshire that kind of checked the boxes of what I wanted, and I couldn't find one, so I just made one up. But there's plenty of towns that are close to that, so I do have an idea in my head of like where things are, what it looks like, where the gated communities exist, that kind of a thing.
Totally random, but do they still make kids make dioramas?
I don't know. It's maybe at science fairs.
Maybe. I feel like we're showing. I mean, I feel like I had to make dioramas as a kid, so I don't know if I'm showing my age or not. But
I did too.
Yeah. What is it about psychological suspense thriller, that genre, that draws you to writing within it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have my own podcast. So I talk to authors all the time and I ask similar questions. And, regardless of what they write, I was just talking to a horror writer, and, most writers will say they don't know. And I think that's fair. A lot of times it's like what you were what you enjoyed reading growing up, I certainly gravitated to Stephen King and books of suspense for sure. But I think, one, I think I'm good at it, and I think you gravitate to the talents that you have. I don't think I would be good at writing romance or maybe some other genres. But I just like conflict. I like writing about conflict because a lot of people say, well, that's dark. Why do you write such dark stuff? To me, my books are hopeful because, as much as I throw conflict at my characters, I do want to see them succeed. They just have to work really hard for it. So, and I think, again, it's that safe space. It's like, why do you watch horror movies? Well, I watch horror movies because I can be scared and safe at the same time. And that's kind of what writing thrillers is like. It's like I get to live these kind of scary, thrilling things, but know that I'm always safe. So I think that's what draws me to it.
Okay, makes sense. That's fair. I was kind of giggling when you were saying, you could write romance, and this book, it could have gone that direction. You could have had a lovely encounter of an American tourist in an Irish bar, and you could have had a very nice Hallmark movie. But no, you had to go the dark route.
Yeah, I believe heavily in writing from a place of emotion, whatever that emotion may be. So if my characters are in love, I do want to explore what that love is and understand the depth of it rather than just saying these characters are in love. So it is important to me every time I sit down and write. I come from a space of like, what is everybody feeling? And because I think that's when you get more of a genuine story than just like, the plot, these things happen. Without emotion, I think a story's nothing. Yeah,
absolutely. This book has 7-year-old twins. I can't remember how old Max was in the last book, but there are children in the books. Do you find children fairly easy to write, or is it harder to kind of tap into what children might be thinking at any given age?
They're difficult for sure. I mean, I'm a father, so I've my kids are 19 and 17, so I've experienced obviously raising kids at those ages. The kids I write about are typically a little messed up. But I love writing, about kids because they're so unfiltered and they're just, they kind of reveal things to the other characters that maybe the other characters are just trying to avoid seeing. And just because of how innocent kids are, it just makes it for I think a great development to have kids in there. But they need to contribute to the story, right? They need to have the plot move forward, and it also always raises the stakes, right? And that's always interesting to me. So if there's a parent-child relationship in the book, any threat to that child, it just becomes overwhelming. So I just like the fact that they can also be used to raise the stakes significantly in a story.
Yeah. Children or a dog, don't do anything to those in the book, or it's definitely going to make it a different book.
Yep, I've learned my lesson on that.
I think we talked about that last time.
Yeah.
Time for the last break, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Carter Wilson.
What are you working on right now?
So I've been writing something for quite some time. It's probably the most difficult book I've ever written, just because it's changed so much over time. But it's it's a little bit different. It's a thriller, but it's about a 21-year-old woman in 1987, and she's a savant. She became a savant through physical trauma when she was young. And it's just kind of about her trying to find her father, who left when she was in a coma, back when she went through that trauma. So it's gone through a lot of different revisions. I'm probably a few weeks out from, kind of the final major revision. And then hopefully it'll be out, late next year.
All right. And when you take time to read for yourself, what have you been reading lately, I guess, is a good question.
That is a good question. I'm always reading something. I'm actually now reading the new Cormac McCarthy novel, which I think is his first one in 15 years, since The Road. And it's a difficult read, but it's good. And I just read Mark Stevens's, he's a buddy of mine, The Fireballer. It's a baseball novel coming out in January, and it's fantastic. But I alternate between fiction and nonfiction, but I read every day, but it might be 5 minutes and then I fall asleep in bed. But I do make sure I read every day.
Yep, understandable. I tend to read before bed, even if I can barely keep my eyes open. It has to be at least a few minutes.
And then the next night you reread what you read because you can't remember. And then you're on the same chapter for 3 weeks.
Exactly. Yes. Well, I know that you have a website, so if you can refresh people about your social media or your internet presence, website and social media.
Yep. Everything's just my website's carterwilson.com. And then that, if you just go there, it has all my links to Facebook and Instagram. And I am not on Twitter.
All right. Thank you. Carter, is there anything that we haven't covered during this time that you were wanting to highlight?
I don't think so. I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to get a chat with you again.
Well, I appreciate you joining me. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to Carter for joining me a second time. I was actually remembering that the last time I interviewed him, and I did not give you the episode number rather, if you want to go back and listen to that other episode where we talk about the dead husband, and that episode is number 301. But I interviewed him last summer when I was in Montana, and I loaned that book to a friend of mine so she could read it. And she said, I got a text from her after I'd gone back to California, and she said that her husband kept giving her weird looks because she was reading The Dead Husband, and he was like, "Are you trying to tell me something?" It just made me laugh, and I thought about that this time when we were talking about a little bit about that book in addition to The New Neighbor. But thank you to Carter for joining me. If you are a fan of this genre, suspense, psychological, definitely psychological with this one. There's a lot going on underneath the surface, and there's a lot going on with the main character of Aiden, as well as some of the secondary characters. His children, obviously, his father has some things in his past that are feeding into his relationship with Aiden, and there's just a lot going on. And I just remembered that I was going to tell Carter that I think Maya, the lawyer, we didn't really talk much about her character, but I kind of feel like she needs her own novel. I want to know more about her, but that's neither here nor there in terms of this. But again, if you're looking for holiday gifts, there's still time to shop, and maybe this is something that you want to give someone. You could give the two as a set, The Dead Husband and The New Neighbor, and since they're both standalones, you can definitely read them on their own, but the setting is the same, which is interesting. Not really sequels, but two books set in the same house, which makes for kind of an interesting connection for this duology. Again, they're standalones, they're not a duology, but you know what I mean. Thank you, as always, to you for joining me for these interviews and for chatting about books. I am very, very grateful to you. If you are a fan of this podcast, you know what I'm going to say next. Like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. Again, that just helps you get the episodes as soon as they come out, and then you won't miss any, or there won't be any surprises when there's an extra episode during the week. Also, leave a review. Very, very lovely if you could do that. Starred or written or thumbs up emoji. I mean, however it works on your platform. Again, it just helps to get this podcast out to more book lovers, such as yourselves. Wow, can't talk. It not only helps the podcast, but it helps the authors who are on the podcast, because then more people learn about their books and maybe want to read them and leave them reviews. It's just a whole circle of podcast publishing, reading, what have you. And then also follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and tell me what you're reading. Check in, tell me what you're reading. Tell me, again, if you've read any of the authors that I've interviewed and what you have thought about their books, which books you have read, and even books by authors that have been on the podcast that we haven't talked about. I would love to hear your thoughts. So hit me up on social media. In the meantime, I've already said in the meantime a couple of times, haven't I? Doesn't matter. I hope you're having a good week. Hope it's off to a really good start. Hope it continues to go well, but regardless, as always, I hope that your week affords you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.